Today, I will be discussing white riots and Black resistance, a history of racial violence in America. But before I begin this video, I just want to emphasize that race is a social construct. There is no such thing as a pure race. All human beings originate from Africa. Culturally, we are also deeply interconnected. We are all what you might call a polycultural society, where different cultural traditions interact and influence one another, rather than existing in isolation. I say this because in the American imagination, we often see ourselves as separate and unconnected. And indeed, this helped fuel the ideas of riots and of real violence that came with the violence of racial violence. And unfortunately, in the American imagination, riots have been overwhelmingly associated with Black communities. Since the 1960s, media and political figures have portrayed urban uprisings as acts of senseless destruction, reinforcing racist stereotypes of Black criminality and chaos. Yet this narrative ignores a fundamental truth. For most of American history, riots were the work of white mobs, not Black communities. These white riots were not spontaneous expressions of frustration, but deliberate acts of racial violence, designed to maintain white supremacy by enforcing segregation, suppressing Black political participation, and destroying Black economic power. White riots were about domination, eliminating threats to white privilege by any means necessary. They were triggered by Black political gains, economic success, and even the basic acts of self-defense against racial oppression. Meanwhile, Black-led uprisings, such as those of the 1960s and beyond, have been responses to systematic racism erupting in communities that face poverty, police brutality, and years of state neglect. While white riots enforce racial hierarchy, Black uprisings have been desperate attempts to challenge it. Despite this history, public memory has been reshaped to erase white riots from mainstream discourse, allowing white supremacy to remain unchallenged. In this video essay, I will discuss historical examples that reveal how rioters have terrorized Black communities, disrupted their progress, and ensured that America remained a society structured by racial inequality. Hi, you're in class with Dr. T. Following the Civil War, African Americans gained political rights under Reconstruction, electing Black officials and organizing for equal rights. This brief period of progress, however, was met with extreme white backlash, often in the form of deadly riots. For example, the Memphis riots of 1866. White police officers and Confederate sympathizers led a massacre in Memphis, Tennessee, killing 46 Black people, raping Black women, and destroying homes and churches. The goal was to crush Black political engagement and reinforce white control. Then there was the New Orleans massacre in 1866. A white mob attacked Black delegates at a constitutional convention advocating for voting rights, killing 44 African Americans. This attack successfully undermined efforts to establish racial equality in Louisiana. Then there was the Colfax massacre of 1873 in Louisiana as well. Around 150 Black men were murdered by white paramilitary groups for defending a courthouse from a white supremacist takeover. This massacre solidified white rule in the South. Also, there was the Wilmington Insurrection of North Carolina of 1898. This was the only successful coup d'etat up to this date in U.S. history. White supremacists violently overthrew the elected biracial government of Wilmington, North Carolina, massacring black residents and replacing black officials with white leaders. These riots were not random acts of violence. They were calculated attacks to dismantle black political power and ensure that white rule remained unchallenged. Throughout the early 20th century, black laborers migrating north were met with hostility from white workers who viewed them as threats to job security. Instead of directing their anger at industrial capitalists exploiting them all, white workers lashed out at black employees, resulting in deadly riots. For example, in East St. Louis massacre in 1917, white industrial workers rioted against black migrants taking wartime jobs, killing between 40 and 250 African Americans and burning black neighborhoods to the ground. Or in the Chicago race riot of 1919, a black teenager was killed for crossing into a white designated beach, triggering a week-long riot where white gangs murdered 23 black residents and torched their homes. And of course, there was the famous Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, one of the most notorious white riots in history. A mob destroyed Greenwood, a relatively prosperous black business district today known as Black Wall Street, killing up to 300 black residents, leveling over 1,200 buildings. Not to be forgotten was the Rosewood Massacre of 1923. After a false accusation against a black man, white mobs burned the thriving black town of Rosewood, Florida to the ground, killing black residents and permanently erasing the entire community. White riots were about preventing black economic independence, ensuring that black workers remained dependent on white employers and that black communities never accumulated generational wealth or true equality. Even after the legal end of segregation, white communities violently resisted integration, attacking black families who attempted to live in white neighborhoods or access white-only institutions. For example, the Detroit race riot of 1943, fueled by tensions over black employment in wartime industries, white rioters killed 25 black residents, reinforcing racial divisions in the labor market. Or the Cicero race riot of 1951, a black family attempted to move in an all-white Chicago suburb, triggering a white mob attack that resulted in firebombed buildings and thousands of rioters violently resisting black ownership. Or what about the Zoot Suit riots? This was not an African-American riot. This was an attack against the Mexican-American community. In this case, Mexican-American youth in so-called Zoot Suits were attacked for defying racial and cultural norms, seen as unpatriotic during wartime. Similar to the attacks on black communities, white mobs used violence to enforce racial hierarchies, with authorities blaming victims while protecting white aggressors, reinforcing systematic oppression. So let's be clear. These white riots were not only against African Americans, they were against those who were perceived as non-white, thus showing again that these constructions of race are merely constructions. It's about power, it's about hierarchy. While white riots have been acts of aggression, so-called black riots, or as some scholars have called uprisings, have been responses to oppression. The 1960s saw the rise of urban revolts in a response to racial discrimination, economic exclusion, and police violence. For example, the Watts riots of 1965. After decades of police brutality and economic neglect in Los Angeles, a routine traffic stop escalated into a 6-day uprising. Detroit Rebellion of 1967 was another example, triggered by the violent police raid of an unlicensed bar in a black neighborhood. The rebellion reflected a deep frustration with racial injustice and economic disparity. Then there was the Miami riot of 1980, following the acquittal of 4 white officers who brutally killed black motorist Arthur McDuffie. Miami's black community erupted in outrage, demanding justice in a system that continuously divided their lives. Or what about the Los Angeles uprising of 1992, the acquittal of 4 LAPD officers who savagely beat Rodney King, caught on videotape, sparked a massive uprising. The rebellion was about more than one case. It was an outcry against systematic economic deprivation and police brutality. Also, the LA riot was an interracial riot that included people of all races. Moreover, there were many other examples of riots or uprisings, if you will, in Newark and throughout the country. Unlike white riots, black uprisings, if you will, were not aimed at controlling or oppressing another racial group. They were desperate responses to systematic injustice, the result of a system that failed to provide equal opportunities, safety, or dignity to its African American citizens and to non-African, or rather non-white as well. As Dr. Martin Luther King famously said, a riot is a language of the unheard. He made this statement in a 1967 interview explaining that African American riots arise from systematic injustice and the failure of society to address the grievances of marginalized communities. While he remained committed to nonviolence, right? So Dr. King did not support looting, rioting. He urged people to understand that these riots were a response to oppression, not just random chaos, right? So although we may not agree with looting and so on, we understood that generally when African Americans and other minorities, including cases of other white ethnics who had to also fight for their quote-unquote whiteness, or really to be treated as a human, these riots were a response to oppression. But when they were deemed, or should I say, when they were done by people who considered themselves to be white, they were not about fighting for justice. They were about oppressing others, and primarily African Americans. I would argue white riots also had class elements, but unlike black riots, white riots were a way of distancing themselves from other blacks and non-white people, like the Mexican Americans in the zoot suits. These riots helped to promote a psychological way of feeling good about oneself, while putting primarily African Americans and others oppressed down. American history has been rewritten to erase the long and bloody legacy of white riots while criminalizing black uprisings as lawless chaos. The truth is that white riots helped maintain the system of racial inequality we see today. They were used to suppress black political power, prevent black economic success, and enforce segregation. Meanwhile, black-led uprisings were reactions to systematic oppression, moments when communities could no longer endure state-sanctioned brutality and economic exclusion. The narrative that black communities are uniquely violent is a lie, designed to justify racist policing, mass incarceration, and a long history of economic neglect. To truly understand the roles of riots in America, we must acknowledge who the real rioters have been, not those fighting for justice, but those who fought to preserve white supremacy. Until this history is fully recognized, the consequences of white riots will continue to define racial inequality in America today. But let me add a quota to the conclusion. In understanding this history, it is crucial not to demonize Euro Americans. First, most people classified as white did not participate in these riots. Second, as scholars like David Roediger and Noah Negative have demonstrated, whiteness has historically been a political choice, one that allowed European immigrants, often seen as so-called in-between races, for example, the Irish, the Jews, the Italians, and other Eastern Europeans, to gain social mobility. But in order for them to gain this social mobility, they had to align against African Americans. Those who rejected this racial hierarchy faced consequences. For example, interracial marriage was outlawed in many states. Another example, government policies like redlining imposed penalties for living in integrated neighborhoods. Structural barriers made association with African Americans costly, reinforcing segregation. Thus, this video essay does not suggest that Euro Americans were inherently predisposed to racial violence. Rather, history shows that there were no clear social and economic incentives that encouraged such riots. But to overcome these legacies, we must confront the truth about American history, dismantle the social economic barriers that uphold hierarchical systems, and work towards a society that fully embraces our interconnectivity and embraces the idea of polyculturalism. Thank you. Please like, please share, please subscribe, and smash that bell